Hello friends, welcome to a new episode of Drishti IAS Editorial Analysis. In this editorial analysis, we do three things. First of all, we link the editorial to the UPSC syllabus. Secondly, we try to understand the key points of the editorial. And thirdly, if any key concepts have come in the editorial and are important from exam point of view, we also discuss them. So let us begin today's editorial analysis.
Dear viewer, this video is available in Hindi as well. If you wish to watch it, please visit our Hindi YouTube channel, Drishti IAS. For your convenience, the link for this video in Hindi has been provided in the description below.
We have taken today's editorial from the Hindu and it has appeared on 15th of August. The title of the editorial is Limited Peace and it basically talks about the recent historic agreement signed between UAE and Israel. So let us look at its linkage with the syllabus. So we find that it links directly with GS paper 2 where we have international relations as one of the important areas of the syllabus. And under this, it can be linked with the bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interests. So after establishing the linkage with the syllabus, now let us look at the key points of the editorial. So before moving on to the key points of the editorial, let us understand what the issue is all about. So here in this map, we can see UAE, which is located here, and here we can see Israel. Now let us look at Israel in a different map. So here in this map, we can see Israel and the two territories of Gaza Strip and West Bank, which are governed by Palestine Authority. And West Bank is central to the recent agreement that has been reached between Israel and UAE. Under the agreement, which has the blessings of US, UAE has decided to recognize Israel. And this is important because UAE has become only the third Arab country to accord this recognition to Israel. And the other two countries being Egypt, which did it in 1979, and Jordan in 1994. On its side, Israel has decided to stop its annexation plans in West Bank. So what has been happening that many Jewish settlers, encouraged by the government of Israel, have been settling in parts of West Bank. And Israel has been continuously encroaching on the territory of West Bank, which is central to the idea of a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine problem, whereby Gaza Strip and West Bank could become part of the future Palestine state. Now let us look at some other key points. So on 13th of August, US President Trump has announced that Israel and UAE had reached a peace agreement. And many countries including European powers and India have welcomed it, whereas Palestinian leadership as well as countries like Turkey and Iran have denounced it. And the deal, which is also known as Abraham Accord. This is important and we should know it. Under this Abraham Accord, first of all, UAE and Israel would establish full diplomatic relations. So UAE has granted recognition to Israel. Secondly, Israel on its part would suspend its plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. So after this brief background, let us look at the key points of the editorial. So the editorial says that the peace agreement that has been reached between Israel and UAE and which has been facilitated by US formalizes the improvement in Arab-Israeli relations that have been seen over the years. Because initially the Arabs at the formation of Israel in 1948 were totally opposed to its existence but have gradually accepted that Israel has come to stay in Middle East and it cannot be obliterated from the map. And this peace agreement which has been reached between Israel and UAE was announced by President Trump, and under this UAE would recognize the state of Israel and establish diplomatic relations with it. and Israel would halt its controversial plan to annex parts of Palestinian West Bank. And this has been hailed as a landmark agreement because UAE becomes only the third Arab country to recognize Israel after Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. This is also important from prelims point of view. And now experts are saying that this could pave way for a regional bloc comprising the Sunni Arab states and Jewish Israel against a Shia majority Iran, which is their common enemy. And if you look at the Arab-Israeli relations, they have been conflict-ridden since the formation of Israel in 1948. In fact, the Arabs and Israel have fought 4 major wars, one in 1948, the other in 1956 over Suez Crisis, the third one in 1967, which is also known as the Six-Day War, and in which Israel occupied many territories. And in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And after all these wars, Israel has gained in strength as well as in territory, whereas the Arab countries have not been able to subdue Israel. And now it seems that the current deal between UAE and Israel will change the Arab-Israeli relations for good. And it also shows how the Arab countries are now gradually decoupling themselves from the Palestine issue. And here another interesting thing to note is that in 1967, after the end of the 6 Days War, where Israel emerged victorious and occupied territories from all the other countries, the Arab countries met at Khartoum in Sudan and they decided on the famous 3 no's. These 3 no's meant that there will be no recognition given to Israel, there will be no talks with Israel, and there will be no peace with Israel. But since then, a lot of things have changed and the Arab-Israeli relations have been on the mend. Now under this deal, UAE has offered full diplomatic recognition in return for Israel's suspension of a planned annexation and not for any relaxation of the actual occupation. And that is why the Palestinians are feeling betrayed by UAE's action. As in this deal, it seems that UAE has only been able to stop Israel from what it was planning to do, and no territorial gains have accrued to the Palestinians. In fact, the UAE's recognition of Israel also goes against the Arab Peace Initiative, which was endorsed by the Arab League and was mooted by Saudi Arab. And this had offered recognition to Israel in exchange for its full withdrawal from the occupied territories. And here we should know what are the occupied territories, and these basically Israel has occupied after the 1967 Six Days War. So from Egypt, it had occupied Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. The Sinai Peninsula has been returned to Egypt by Israel after the Camp David Accord in return for recognition granted by Egypt. From Jordan, it had annexed West Bank and East Jerusalem. Both are in Israel's occupation still. And after Israel and Palestine Authority recognized each other, then Jordan withdrew its claims on West Banks. And in 1994, Jordan also recognized Israel after signing an agreement. And the third country is Syria, from which Israel had occupied the Golan Heights. This is also in the possession of Israel. But now when UAE has accorded recognition to Israel, UAE has not been able to gain any territorial concession from Israel. It has only been able to stop Israel from what it was planning to do. So that has been a major criticism of Palestinians against UAE's action. Now where does this deal leave the Palestinians? So Palestinians are already suffering, and this deal does not do them much good. And the only questions that the editorial raises is whether UAE would be able to press Israel to relax its inhuman and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And this remains to be seen. But the editorial says that the emerging reality is that the Arab-Israeli conflict seems to be on the closing stage. But the Palestine-Israel conflict will continue. And that is the sad part. So this was all in the key points of the editorial. Now let us look at India's reaction to this deal in the key concept section. So West Asia is a very important geography for India because of two reasons. First is that lot of expatriates are in West Asia and India is the major receiver of remittances from them. The other part is that it is critical to India's energy security as most of the oil supplies are sourced from West Asian countries. So India's reaction to this peace agreement has been positive. India has welcomed the normalization of ties between Israel and UAE, calling them both key strategic partners, as India has very good relations both with Israel and UAE. And India has said that it supports peace, stability and development in West Asia, which it considers its extended neighborhood. Now this is a very important term, that India considers West Asia to be its extended neighborhood. And India has deep stakes in West Asia because of energy supplies and the large expatriate population residing in the countries. India will also need to watch its ties with Iran, which is not happy with the deal and which will see any Arab-Israeli tie-up as a direct threat to its security. So here India will have to walk a fine line between its relations with Iran and with the Arab countries. And as far as the Palestinian question is concerned, India supports a two-state solution as part of a negotiated settlement between Israel and Palestine. And this has been India's traditional policy. But there has been a major change in India's foreign policy since the new government has taken power in India. And that has been the de-hyphenation policy. Earlier, India was hyphenating Israel and Palestine. So whenever the Prime Minister or any important minister of the cabinet was visiting Israel, then that minister was also supposed to visit Palestine and maintain a balance. But now India has moved to a de-hyphenated policy under which India's relationship with Israel would stand on its own merits, independent and separate from India's relationship with the Palestinians. So no more balancing, but following India's enlightened self-interest. So this has been a major change in India's foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine issue. So this was all in the editorial analysis. Now let us look at the kind of questions that can be asked in prelims and mains. So in prelims, direct question can be asked on UAE-Israel peace deal and what is it known as. So we should know that it is known as Abraham Accord. And the deal has been brokered by US and the main points of the deal, which is that UAE has granted recognition to Israel and Israel has agreed to suspend its annexation plans in West Bank. Also, map-based questions can be asked. So one should be clear about Israel and its location on the map, about the location of UAE and the location of places such as West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights. Another question in prelims can be asked on how many countries have recognized Israel and when. So Egypt was the first one in 1979, Jordan followed in 1994 and now UAE 2020. And UAE is the first Gulf country and the third Arab country. That also we should know. If we come to mains, then a question can be asked on the impact of UAE-Israel peace agreement on Palestine issue, that is the two-state solution, how this deal can impact it. Also a question can be asked on the concerns related to Iran, whether this is about cornering Iran or not. Finally, a question can be asked on India's stand and reaction to this deal, followed by a question on the dehyphenated foreign policy of India with respect to Israel and Palestine. So on these points we should be prepared. So this was all in today's editorial analysis. We'll see you next time with another editorial. Thank you.